Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we look at these huge interlocking crises. The kind of things that keep economists and political scientists up at night, and, well, frankly, all of us.
Exactly.
And today, we are not looking at the balance sheets. We're not talking about legislative bills. We are zooming way, way in on what some critical theorists say is the hidden engine of all of this contemporary instability.
And that engine is rooted deep inside us, in our psyche.
It's the chaotic flow of our passions, our attachments, our desires, even our aggressions.
Right. I mean, we so often analyze something like an economic collapse or, political polarization through these very standard lenses: governance, financial regulation.
The usual suspects.
The usual suspects, yeah. But what if the real battlefield is one of desire? What if the reason the system keeps going, even when we're facing what people are calling the polycrisis or omnicrisis, is that it's just perfected the art of, well, organizing and exploiting our emotional lives?
That is the absolute core premise of our exploration today. We are going deep into some of the most provocative corners of critical theory to really get our hands around the libidinal economy.
Which is a powerful concept, a complex one for sure.
It is, and it can be a bit confronting. But it's this study, both quantitative and qualitative, of how libido, that fundamental psychosocial energy, is organized, channeled, exploited, and ultimately destabilized by the whole structure of contemporary capitalism.
So our mission here, really, is to move past that surface-level idea of libido just being about sex.
Right.
We're asking the bigger questions. How does the social order actually monitor and modulate, and let's be honest, monetize our deepest drives, our desires? And what does this whole psychic life of capitalism tell us about the system's ability to extract not just economic surplus, but affective surplus, emotional surplus?
So just to be super clear for you, the listener, when we throw around this term libidinal economy, what we're really describing is the entire flow of emotional and psychic energy. It's the way our desires, our drives, our attachments are organized to make us act and relate and, I guess, just endure the world we live in. It's the infrastructure of feeling that holds up the infrastructure of finance.
That's a perfect way to put it. And to really analyze that infrastructure, we have to start at the absolute foundation.
And that means we have to start with the original architect of all this, Sigmund Freud.
Of course.
He was the one who first came up with this idea that there's an economy to the mind, a whole system where energy moves around, gets invested, and can, be totally depleted.
Freud's genius was really in proposing what he called the economic problem for psychoanalysis. And this is all about the rise and fall of libidinal intensities. He treated this energy almost like a quantity.
Like a value.
A quantitative value, exactly. A measure of excitation in the psychic system, even though he was the first to admit you couldn't actually measure it with any scientific instrument. He said it was one of the most obscure regions of psychoanalysis, but he knew it was absolutely essential for understanding things like neurotic symptoms or just, psychic balance.
And this energy, this libido, it was very specifically tied to what he called the sexual instincts.
Right, which he viewed very, very broadly. It's the energy that takes these raw, physical, somatic sexual impulses and transforms them into psychical energy. The kind of energy that then gets deployed across our thoughts, our memories, our attachments to people and things.
And that specific focus on sexuality is so key. It's where he really broke with his one-time student and rival, Carl Jung.
A huge break. Jung wanted to make what's called a monistic move. He wanted to expand the idea of libido to cover, well, all psychic energy, willpower, creativity, just the general life force.
Kind of flattening it out.
Completely.
Yeah.
And Freud resisted that, tooth and nail. He insisted that libido, even though it can influence non-sexual acts through things like sublimation, is fundamentally and always rooted in the sexual instincts. And that focus on sexuality as this primary disruptive force is what gives the whole concept of a libidinal economy its critical edge.
What's so fascinating to me, though, is that even while he anchored it in sexuality, the concept of libido he came up with was incredibly flexible. It immediately went way beyond just a simple biological drive for reproduction.
Oh, absolutely. Freud saw that human sexuality is just fundamentally different from the instinctual life of, say, an animal.
Right.
A biological instinct has a fixed object, right? The thing it needs for reproduction, and it has a fixed aim.
But libido doesn't.
Not at all. Freud's libido has an undefined object, a variable aim, and all these variable modalities of satisfaction. And that is why human pleasure is so diverse. It's why we can get satisfaction from activities that are so far removed from the reproductive act itself.
And this is where we get this really surprising insight from the sources we're looking at. They suggest that because our sexuality is so flexible, things like idiosyncratic kinks, those really unique, singular ways people find satisfaction, they actually epitomize sex more than standard reproductive coitus does in modern Western culture.
It's a fantastic point because kinks or perversions or any non-reproductive activities, they show the true symbolic power of the libido.
Yeah.
They show that it's not just about biology.
It's about meaning.
It's an interpretive symbolic act, but, and this is a huge but, this very flexibility creates an immediate and, well, a profound conflict. Because our sexual drives, in all their polymorphous, flexible glory, they clash violently with conventional morality, with social norms, with the kind of performance that civilization demands from us.
So what's the psychic consequence of that clash? What happens inside our heads?
The sexual wishes get modified, they get displaced, often they get repressed.
Yeah.
And this is precisely the stuff that furnishes the realms of our fantasy life. Fantasy is the space where all those repressed wishes get to be played out. For an erotic subject, the psychic investment can be so total that their symptoms, their anxiety, their compulsions, that becomes the entire sphere of their sexual life. The energy has been successfully diverted and, modified by this social pressure cooker.
Okay, so we've established libido as this foundational energy. Now we have to jump forward a bit into the later theoretical frameworks, specifically the work of Jacques Lacan, who gives us this absolutely crucial tool for navigating the modern world, the distinction between desire and drive. In, everyday language, we use them interchangeably.
We do.
But here, they're basically antagonists.
They are radical opposites in their logic. Yeah. Desire is tied to language, to naming things. It's what he calls a principle of negativity. It's always seeking a lost or unstable object. The classic idea of your other half.
The thing that will complete you.
Exactly. It aims to obtain an object, but that object is always just a substitute for some original missing thing. Lacan even called it the desire for nothing nameable. But at the same time, it's the animating force of our whole subjectivity. It's relational. It seeks some kind of stabilization, even if that's ultimately impossible.
Right. So if I desire a new car, the moment I get it, that specific desire kind of dies. And then I just start desiring the next thing. I'm always chasing an external object, hoping it's the one that will finally fill a void. That sounds exhausting, but manageable.
It is the human condition, in a way. Always seeking substitutes for a fundamental lack. But drive is something else entirely. It is ceaseless looping, repetition.
Okay.
It's not about getting the object, it's about the circuit itself. The subject gets captured by this repetitive process, often centered around what's called a partial object. The gaze, the voice, the breast, or, in today's world, the screen.
We need a clear analogy here. So if desire is like reading a restaurant menu, you're looking for that perfect meal to satisfy a specific hunger. What is drive?
Drive is like compulsively scrolling through delivery apps, not to actually order anything, but for the sheer repetitive motion of your thumb on the screen. The enjoyment of the drive, the jouissance, comes from never reaching satisfaction. It's failure to actually close the loop. That is its success.
Wow, okay.
It's pure process. The drive doesn't want the object. It wants the repetition of circulating around the object. And that distinction is absolutely critical if you want to understand something like addictive consumption.
That failure is success loop, that perfectly captures why so many of us feel trapped in systems of consumption or even in intimacy, which brings us to this really shocking idea from Lacan, the famous lack of sexual relation.
Yes. Even in what we think of as moments of ultimate intimacy, that symbolic disconnection is always there.
Yeah.
Because the drive is operating in its own closed loop. Your partner, the object of your physical pleasure, is never fully one-to-one the object of your desire.
You might be fantasizing that your partner is someone else.
You might. Or you might just feel this immense disconnect because the relationship we're seeking in sex is always triangular. It's you, the object, and the desire of the other. And this reinforces the idea that sex, in our symbolic tradition, is idealized as this ultimate intimacy, but psychoanalysis kind of pulls back the curtain and suggests it might be among the most fundamentally non-intimate things we do. It's often defined more by drive satisfaction than by relational desire.
It feels like we're tracing two completely opposed logics here, one based on absence and lack, which is desire,
Right.
and another based on affirmation and force, which is drive. And this brings us to the really philosophical, deep underpinning of all this.
It does, because these psychological dynamics, they're not just in our heads. They are fundamentally intertwined with metaphysics, with our basic assumptions about how reality itself operates. Philosophical theories of desire are always intrinsically linked to theories of reality, to ontology.
Let's unpack that, because it's a crucial point for anyone listening. The way you view reality actually determines the way you view desire. So let's start with the older, more traditional model.
Okay, so we could look at what's called analogical ontology.
Yeah.
You see this in thinkers like Aristotle or Descartes. This is a view where existence is predicated in multiple ways. God exists differently than a human being, who exists differently than a stone.
There's a hierarchy.
There's a hierarchy, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that implies a lack, an imperfection in the lower levels of being. And this framework aligns perfectly with negative desire. Desire is a striving toward an absence, a lack. It's movement driven by what are called final causes. You're being pulled forward by something that isn't here yet.
Yeah.
You're striving toward an idealized state like Plato's forms, or you're missing other half.
And this is the traditional understanding, this lack model. It maps so easily onto the neurotic structure that psychoanalysis so often deals with. But then there's a radical break.
A huge radical break. And it comes with univocal ontology, which was popularized by thinkers like Ibn Sina and, most famously, Spinoza. This view claims that everything that exists in one and the same sense. Reality is absolutely infinite and positive.
So there's no space for negativity, no absence, no lack.
Exactly. And if reality is all just positive being, then desire cannot possibly be defined by what's missing.
So if there's no lack, then what on earth is desire?
It shifts entirely. It becomes positive desire. Desire is understood as an inherent driving force, an efficient causal interaction that happens because of an actual encounter in the world. It's the striving of the subject, what Spinoza called conatus, to just persist in its being and increase its power.
And the political implication there is staggering.
It is, because if you accept a univocal, force-based ontology, you have to give up this idea that desire is about striving to overcome a lack. You have to start seeing its pure production, pure positive affirmation.
And why is that intellectual commitment so vital for this whole deep dive? Why does it matter which one you choose?
Because the critical theorists we're looking at today argue that contemporary capitalism, with its relentless push for growth, its absolute hatred of stasis, its constant focus on more, it has completely mastered the mobilization of this positive force-based desire and the repetitive drive.
While at the same time?
While at the same time, it exploits the lack inherent in negative desire to sell us things. Capital demands that we act as these machines of pure affirmation, the joyous automobile, the self-starter, even while it generates the structural lack and anxiety that fuels all of our consumer desire. The entire system is built on these two conflicting yet perfectly exploited philosophical engines. Which brings us right to the contemporary question. How does capitalism actually capture and organize these profound and, as we said, often contradictory flows of our psychic energy?
We can start with this really major theoretical convergence between Marx and Freud. They were separated by disciplines, obviously, but they offered a startlingly similar diagnosis of a social system, a system that actively works to dismantle social bonds, a system we're calling organized antisociality, all in the service of extracting the maximum surplus.
Marx saw this antisociality in capital's, its relentless, cold focus on self-valorization, on accumulation. It has this active indifference, and sometimes it's an outright hostility toward actual human life, toward social connection. It's a structure defined by its one singular, self-serving goal.
And Lacan, looking at this from a psychoanalytic perspective, he suggested a homologous surplus.
Right.
Which means there's a kind of structural equivalence between Marx's surplus value, that economic abstraction that's extracted from labor,
and surplus enjoyment, what he called plus du jour, the psychic abstraction that's extracted from the subject.
That's a pretty radical claim.
It's a hugely radical claim. It suggests that surplus value isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It can be understood as a systemic form of enjoyment that's inherent in the capital mechanism itself. Capital enjoys its own accumulation. And we, the subjects, are sort of coerced into enjoying our own exploitation through that repetitive, addictive logic of the drive.
So this critique of capitalist antisociality, it isn't just saying the system is mean. It's saying it's structurally designed to be this way. It's not a bug, it's a feature.
It is the core feature. And if capital is this actively antisocial force, you have to wonder, how has it managed our affections over time? The sources we're looking at map this whole effective history of this subject under capitalism, using Spinoza's idea of conatus.
That's striving to increase joy or power.
Exactly. And the story of desire under capital is a progression. It moves through distinct phases.
A compelling narrative, for sure.
It is. It starts with the first phase, formal subsumption. This is your classic early industrial capitalism. And the dominant effective orientation here is just profoundly negative.
Fear. Sadness.
Fear, sadness, frustration. That makes intuitive sense, right? Labor is just endured out of raw necessity. It's what we might call wage slavery. The primary goal is just self-preservation in this really precarious environment. There's no ideological buy-in. It's just necessity.
Then we get this dramatic shift, Fordism and the consumer society in the mid-20th century.
Right. The effective burden, it doesn't just disappear, but it shifts its valence. The negative effects at work, the pure boredom of the assembly line, that becomes tolerable because the subject is anticipating the pleasures of consumption.
So the anxiety of the wage slave is swapped for the anxiety of needing to afford all the stuff that defines the good life.
That's it, exactly. It's a societal bargain. You give us 8 hours of your physical labor and your psychic pain, and in return, we give you a path to a shiny new refrigerator or a car, something that generates short-term joy.
It's a compensatory mechanism.
It is. But the truly insidious phase, according to thinkers like Frederick Lorton, is neoliberalism, the third stage. And here, the whole effective landscape gets fundamentally reorganized. Pleasure is reoriented back toward work itself.
Wait, reoriented back toward work? How does that even work psychically? That seems like a huge leap.
It is. But the modern subject isn't supposed to be merely compliant. They have to want to be there. They have to actively desire employment itself, often completely stripped of any reference to the particular task they're doing. They internalize the capitalist imperative.
So the subject starts to identify as a kind of professional entrepreneur of the self.
Exactly. Lorton calls this the motivated, joyous automobile.
The joyous automobile. That's a brilliant and kind of terrifying term. What does that look like in practice for you listening at home?
It looks like the mandatory enthusiasm of the modern worker. You have to constantly demonstrate that you're proactive, you're adaptable, you're a self-starter. The line between your personal interest and the company's interest, it just shrinks to zero.
You get congratulated for taking on unpaid overtime because it shows you have passion.
Exactly. The emotional extraction is total. Your striving, your conatus, is now perfectly congruent with the system's mandate for continuous, infinite growth. And burnout in this system is just the sign of a successful, striving subject who has given too much. It's almost a mark of honor, not a sign of systemic failure.
That completely reframes stress. So if the system rewards this enthusiastic entrepreneurial self, what happens when the material conditions start to fail? Because we're seeing a lot of failure in late neoliberalism, declining real wages, perpetual precarity, institutions decaying.
And that leads us to the next and maybe the defining effective stage of late neoliberalism, negative solidarity. This is the coping mechanism for when the joyous automobile hits a massive financial pothole.
So how does that psychic composition work?
It's this weird transvaluation of sadness into joy, where suffering and incapacity actually become a source of perverse pride. It's pride in your discipline, your toughness, your self-reliance. All of these coping strategies deployed against a very real background of structural decline and systemic powerlessness. The subject is basically saying, I am tough because I endure this horrible situation.
And that internal pride immediately gets translated into external aggression, doesn't it?
Immediately. This pride is inseparable from anger and what Nietzsche called resentment, this indignation that's directed outward toward those who are perceived as not working hard enough, or those who are benefiting from, say, collective action or welfare. This anger then functions as this powerful, organized, antisocial bond. You feel solidarity only with those who share your imposed suffering.
And you define yourselves against the perceived slackers.
Exactly. I can see this instantly in contemporary political discourse. You see these arguments against things like student loan forgiveness, and they often come from people who really struggle to pay off their own loans. And their argument is, I suffered, so everyone else must suffer too.
It's an embrace of shared hardship as a moral good.
It is. And it's the perfect illustration of the scapegoat mechanism that's inherent in negative solidarity. The anger gets redirected away from the systemic forces that cause the precarity in the first place, and it gets aimed at people who are lower on the socioeconomic ladder. The system brilliantly manages to turn this horizontal resentment into a vertical defense of the capitalist status quo.
The sources cite that popular bumper sticker, "Keep working, millions on welfare depend on you." That is a powerful piece of psychological warfare.
Oh, it's absolutely brilliant in a sinister way. That interpolation, that demand it makes on the audience, it draws you into this collective we that is defined by a shared indignation against these fabricated slackers. It creates this feeling of moral superiority, which gives you a temporary compensation for your very real material insecurity.
And to keep this whole structure going, capital has to constantly reinforce its own history.
Yes, through what's called a mythic economy. The oldest, most persistent myths of capital are revived. You know the story. Primitive accumulation, the frugal, hardworking capitalist versus the lazy, spendthrift individual.
And that gets projected onto the present.
Constantly. Work, particularly productivist labor, becomes endowed with this immense symbolic value, completely regardless of its declining material wage. Hardship gets reframed as an ethical achievement, which makes it that much harder for subjects to ever question the fundamental fairness of the system itself.
So this sustained psychic exploitation, it inevitably leads to breaking points, which we then label crises. You've already established we're living in an age of the polycrisis and the omnicrisis.
Where just predicting and measuring instability feels like a completely Sisyphean task.
And this pervasive sense of crisis, it's not just a description of events, it's highly performative. Crisis talk is never neutral. The moment a crisis is declared, that state of crisis immediately alters how a society sees itself. It signals an emergency status that justifies extraordinary measures. It changes the rules of the game.
And the language of crisis immediately gives authority to certain figures, right?
Precisely. The terminology of crisis, which was originally borrowed from medicine and the military, the crisis point in a fever, the decisive crisis in a battle, it licenses those who get to diagnose and act. It naturally prioritizes technical expertise.
The economic doctor.
Yeah.
And it reinforces their authority while sidelining democratic or deliberative processes because, we don't have time for that.
But if we're in the state of chronic overlapping crises where all the ideological constructs are failing, what happens when people just stop believing the experts? Or when the market abstractions feel way too distant from their daily reality?
When you have a widespread crisis of belief, the institutions have to find something undeniable to ground their authority in. They have to borrow reality. The concept is profound. They take the sheer brute material factualness of the human body and they use it to lend their failing cultural construct, whether it's an economic model or a political narrative, an aura of realness, of certainty.
Can you give us a clear example of that borrowing?
The body in pain is the ultimate incontestable piece of the real. Bodily pain is not an opinion, it is a fact. And this incontestable quality can then be conferred onto whatever caused the pain. Think about war rhetoric. When politicians need to mobilize support for a conflict, they don't lead with financial projections.
No.
They lead with images of the injured body, the veteran sacrifice, the suffering civilian.
So the injured body becomes the ultimate anchor for symbolic authority. It's basically saying, this crisis is real, look at the flesh.
Exactly. The flesh, in its raw somatic reality, it captures both the material and the affective dimensions of the libidinal economy. It's this crucial site for coping. It offers a visceral grounding when all the abstractions fail. And in times of extreme ideological stress, social orders might shift toward more authoritarian solutions because they promise simple, visceral power and a return to the security and simplicity of the body rather than the complexity of abstract systems.
The COVID-19 pandemic gave us a really unique, very recent lens into how the libidinal economy organizes itself during an acute, high-stakes crisis.
Oh, it revealed a startling, affective, and class split. On one side, you had the professional class who experienced what the sources call the self-congratulatory enjoyment of leisurely obedience.
Leisurely obedience.
Right. They could retreat, work from home, focus on gardening, baking bread, hobbies. They were fulfilling this inner wish to just opt out of the relentless competitive performance principle. And the quarantine offered them guilt-free permission to do it.
They enjoyed the structure, the relief from those constant external demands.
Precisely. And meanwhile, you had the essential workers who were facing acute material deprivation, exposure, danger. Their labor was recognized as essential only in the functional sense of keeping capital reproducing, not in terms of getting them protection or compensation. Their very existence became a source of insecurity for the privileged class who depended on their essential yet totally exposed labor.
This enjoyment of structure and domination, it reminds me of some of the more controversial ideas from thinkers like Wilhelm Reich.
It absolutely
Yeah.
does. It reinforces that notion that people might unconsciously desire a strict structure or even forms of soft authoritarianism like a quarantine because they are just profoundly exhausted by the constant performance principle and the relentless pressure of competition. They seek relief in domination. A clear external structure that limits their overwhelming choices and relieves them of subjective responsibility.
And if you look back to what Freud observed after World War I, he talked about what happens to the libido when the world is just ravaged.
To the libido, having lost so many of its objects, security, stability, community, it clings with far greater intensity to whatever is left. And this manifests as fierce nationalism, exaggerated family loyalty, or a desperate clinging to common pride. In our world today, you see this in the resurgence of aggressive, almost manic attachments to identity politics or national myths in response to systemic decay.
Let's pivot to the language we use around economic breakdown. The discourse around crisis relies so heavily on metaphors of pathology.
Oh, constantly. Economic crisis talk is full of metaphors of disease and sickness. Economic growth is the life force, stability is health, and crisis is sickness, deviation, or death. And this pathologizing strengthens the appeal of security and safety, which are, invariably associated with the existing heteronormative and capitalist systems.
And often this takes on a very specific and kind of sexualized dimension in public rhetoric.
Absolutely. Financial speculation, excesses, abstract financial activity, things that are very difficult for people to grasp, are often feminized or associated with diseased and devious aberrations.
Yes.
And this is a mechanism to try and renaturalize the economic system.
How so?
By linking queer bodies or racialized communities or any perceived deviance to financial hazard, the rhetoric attempts to position the sane and safe national economy as being synonymous with the stable, white, patriarchal family structure.
So when reactionary rhetoric claims that we have a crisis of desire, a crisis of masculinity or heterosexuality, it's actually a way of concealing the underlying economic precarity.
Exactly. It uses social anxiety to deflect economic anxiety. The attack is aimed at negating sexual liberation and gender equality. By scapegoating migrants or feminists or queer communities for social misery, they successfully draw attention away from the structural economic causes of that misery. And in doing so, they mobilize all the effective resources of negative solidarity and fear.
And now we have to move into the landscape that just dominates the contemporary libidinal flow, the digital world. The pressure cooker of the achievement subject is just amplified here to an insane degree.
The contemporary subject is driven by performance, by continuous growth, by self-optimization. And this mandate is fundamentally hostile to the emotional reality and, frankly, of the nervous systems of living beings. We're constantly told to maximize our human capital, optimize our routines, be perpetually on.
And the decay of public institutions, of social ties, that only increases the pressure. I mean, if the external world is unreliable and chaotic and lacks symbolic structure, where does the subject turn to invest their energy?
They retreat inward. This is the state of symbolic misery. It leads to energy conservation. It leads to the investment of libido in self-objects, which are often digital ones. You can think of it like a child in a chronically unstable or alcoholic home who learns to withdraw and focus on their own internal consistency because the external world is just too chaotic and painful to engage with.
And the relentless pace of capital, its imperative of continuous growth, that's perfectly compatible with the drive's ceaseless repetition that we talked about earlier.
It's a perfect match. The drive's loop of failure or success perfectly mirrors the logic of accumulation. Complex human desire, which involves things like lack and negation and relationship, gets reduced to mechanical drive. And the consequences are the defining pathologies of our era: burnout, depression, addiction, addictive repetitions. The endless loop of seeking, consuming, repeating are, in a very real sense, capital's preferred mode of accumulation, perfectly tailored for the digital environment.
And the digital space has innovated these incredible new ways to capture this energy through what the sources call transactional intimacy. They cite platforms like OnlyFans as a kind of paradigm for future economic relations.
And these platforms are intimate because they incorporate the worker's whole being, their persona, their desirability, their fantasy life, right into the production process. But they're transactional because the entire interaction is monetized and quantifiable. The performer isn't just selling a service, they're selling a carefully managed simulacrum of availability and connection.
So this digital sex work, or really a lot of influencer culture, it operates through what some theorists call pharmacopornographic management.
That's a complex term. But what it essentially means is that the system manages desire not through old-fashioned repression like, say, Victorian morality,
Right.
but through the incitement and regulation of quantifiable pleasure.
So it's not saying no.
It's saying yes, constantly, but on our terms. Algorithms regulate what you see, how often you see it, at what cost. They produce pleasure while also ensuring maximum engagement. It's management via maximum excitation.
And the ultimate goal is to keep the drive looping, which brings us to this really painful psychological contradiction.
The system is designed for frustrating satisfaction. The platforms have to satisfy you just enough to keep you engaged, but at the same time, they have to generate frustration, anxiety, and loss. The very hallmarks of the libidinal. If you were ever fully satisfied, you would leave.
So the system profits from this cyclical failure.
It's just like Marx's MCM, formula money, commodity more money, but applied to desire. Excitation leads to digital capital, which leads to frustration, which leads back to more excitation.
And this environment, where we are somehow hyper-connected and profoundly isolated at the same time, leads to the parasocial short circuit.
Parasocial relationships, those non-reciprocal attachments you feel to a celebrity, an influencer, a performer, they're the compensatory mechanism for acute loneliness. They simulate intimacy without any of the interpersonal risk.
You get to feel connected and seen and part of a community.
Without ever having to risk vulnerability or real-world confrontation.
And this feeds two separate but simultaneous psychological rewards.
Yes. First, it rewards narcissistic performance on the part of the performer. The influencer attaches their libido to reflections of their own image. They're seeking the abstracted gaze of the other. The likes, the shares, the views. They become their own self-object, infinitely reproducible.
And for the audience, it accommodates schizoid withdrawal.
The isolated subject finds a sense of belonging in an idolized object. They incorporate the generalized desire of the performer into their own internal landscape. They feel seen, but by proxy, without ever taking on the risk of being seen themselves. The ultimate locus of all libidinal investments becomes the personal smartphone, the intimate self-object par excellence, concentrating and channeling all our affective flow.
The constant management of our psychic energy, the reduction of our desire to this mechanical drive, and the forced enthusiasm of the achievement subject, it all makes the traditional liberal idea of freedom, just pursuing your self-interest, it makes it feel increasingly empty.
It really does. Because that liberal conception, it fails at the most basic level. It never bothers to ask where our interests come from in the first place. It just assumes this simplistic one-to-one identity between self-interest and subjectivity, and it ignores the vast unconscious processes that actually define who we are and what we want.
And psychoanalysis offers this really radical counterconception of freedom, one that's rooted in the opacity of the symbolic order.
Right. Freedom is found not in originating some fully conscious project, like a 5-year plan for self-improvement. It's found in the unconscious act of interpreting the other's desire. The demand that's addressed to me by the social world or by another person is always opaque, is often contradictory.
So if the culture, the institution, my partner, if they can't even fully articulate what they demand from me, how does that create freedom?
Because my interpretation of that opaque demand cannot be literal. It requires a subjective, unconscious intervention to make sense of it. And it is in that necessary act of subjective misrecognition and interpretation that my desire is rendered free. I choose my response, not based on my interests, but based on my unique interpretation of an external, opaque demand.
This brings us to a really profound political observation about structure and limits. We so often define freedom as just destroying an external obstacle, tearing down walls, breaking rules.
But that merely requires an external authority to transgress against. True, profound freedom is the power to impose and affirm our own limitations, a self-imposed structure. Freedom is not the absence of structure. It is the power to choose and affirm the rules we live by, and that is what allows for non-repressive enjoyment.
So the political goal of emancipation isn't the anarchic destruction of all structure.
No. That vitalist and arco-left position often misunderstands the necessity of symbolic structure. The political goal, if we're ever going to escape this libidinal capture, must be the production of a new self-imposed master signifier, a new historical norm, a new set of affirmed boundaries that allow us to organize ourselves and our collective desire in a non-exploitative way.
A way to create a structure that supports genuine desire.
rather than just fueling endless repetitive drive.
A structure that recognizes the complexity and the potential of human desire instead of reducing it to a quantifiable transactional unit for extraction.
Exactly. Hashtag tag outro. So we've completed our exploration of the libidinal economies of crisis times. We've mapped the flow of this energy from its Freudian foundations through Spinoza's force all the way to the pathologies of late capitalism. And what we've seen, I think, is an intimate, inescapable connection.
Yeah, that these capitalist systems, they maintain and renew themselves by being incredibly successful at organizing and exploiting our psychic energy.
Right.
And this extraction, it creates these systemic pathologies we've talked about: burnout, narcissism, negative solidarity, while it's also at the same time offering us these false solutions. Things like transactional digital intimacy or achievement myths that only end up reinforcing the core exploitative mechanism.
The essential contradiction of our time, it really remains this tension between the repetitive, ceaseless loop of the drive, which is so compatible with capital's need for continuous growth, and the expansive, often contradictory, non-quantifiable quality of genuine human desire. The system has learned to profit from our frustration, to transactionalize our intimacy, and to borrow the ultimate reality of our pain just to sustain its own illusions.
So if the true battleground is the flesh, the material substrate of our desires, our fantasies, and our pain, then we really have to reevaluate where we're putting our energy. The system rewards the narcissistic retreat, the isolated consumption, the shame-based solidarity.
And we have to ask ourselves, how do we shift our libidinal investment away from this transactional and narcissistic retreat? How do we reanimate the external world as a symbolic field? How do we turn our attention and our energy toward true object love and toward collective forms of individuation?
That feels like the necessity of our political and psychological moment, to educate our desire, to choose limits that are self-imposed and affirming, and ultimately to move beyond the structures that monetize our exhaustion and our deepest unfulfilled wishes. A profound challenge, and one that requires us to look not just at our finances, but deep into the mirror of our own attachments.